Hey, HannahMouse1 here. Welcome to my devlog for the second monthly Muu-Off Scratch game jam, as hosted by Jimmy over at MuuMuuGames. The theme of this jam is deep space, so let's jump right in. Now, I didn't have much of an idea of what I wanted this game to be off the bat, but I did have a pretty instant vision for how I wanted the art to look. Now, normally it's good practice to start with a prototype for a primary gameplay loop that uses placeholder art, but given the limited time that is the linchpin of any game jam, sometimes you have to do whatever it is you can to make progress, so I jumped right in with the art for a player sprite. I went with a very simple vector art style with cell shading and lots of geometric shapes, and I really like how it came out. I also used a limited colour palette throughout my game, which really helped. Once I designed the player, I animated them idling, running and jumping. For the jump, I needed separate animations for them jumping on the spot and jumping whilst moving horizontally. Once I had a decent chunk of the sprite work done, I began to code it in so that the player switches between these animations based on keyboard inputs. As I went, I would sometimes find a costume that needed a little tweak or a new animation that needed making or something, and I fixed these little hiccups whenever I stumbled across them. As I was doing all of this, I was trying to figure out exactly what I wanted this game to be. I settled on a very simplified version of something like Subnautica, but with a lot less water obviously, and a side-on perspective that I was inspired by Terraria to implement. I wanted the player to be able to explore a mysterious planet and to discover the local materials and wildlife with which they needed to survive. I coded the player's movement in line with my vision. There's no collision with any objects except the floor, which made the code for this pretty simple. So then I made a sprite for the floor. I wanted there to be biomes with different floor colours, so I decided to make things easy in the art department by having the floor be comprised of a set of red tiles, with the colour effect of these tiles being used to set the floor colour to be biome appropriate. I got the floor tiles to generate in, and then I used a list to contain the appropriate colour information. It took a little bit of work for me to figure out the way to get these tiles to pull the correct value from the list based on which tile on screen it is and based on the horizontal movement inputs from the player, but I eventually figured it out, and I tried to make the transition between biomes as smooth as possible. I also made a spacey background for this, and if you're wondering why I did this in a sprite rather than a backdrop, it's because I wasn't sure if I would add in something like a daylight cycle or different backgrounds for different biomes or anything else that would require smooth transitions from one background to another. I didn't wind up doing any of that because of time constraints, but I wanted to keep the door open. I then decided to get the first biome sorted. This area would have to have some facilities for the player to use, as well as a bunch of resources, so I needed to create the art for each of the different items. There's an oxygen generator that will refill the player's oxygen stat when they stand near it, and this covers 3 whole tile spaces. And then there are a whole bunch of different scrap piles in different sizes, and the player will be able to harvest these for resources. I added in the set of clones that will display these objects and made it so that the oxygen generator spawns in. I also realised that I would need another facility, the communications unit, to give the player tutorials and to deliver a bit of story. So I made the art for this and got that to spawn in next to the generator. These 2 facilities needed to be in the same place in each generation of the world, but the scrap piles had to be completely random, so I created a system to generate those. Seeing that though, it felt like it needed some more variety, so I also created the art for some fern-like shrubbery and worked those into the generation script. I created item icons for each of the items that you'll be able to collect from these objects, such as some food rations and metal from the scrap piles and ferns from the ferns. I also decided I'd need wood for some of the structures that I wanted to add, and therefore needed to add trees from which to harvest them. I then made it so that the player can interact with objects in the world, with the objects highlighting when you mouse over them. I also created a label to indicate what you are mousing over, with a label for every type of object in the environment, as well as every item that can be dropped. I opted to draw in the letters because none of Scratch's default fonts suited my needs, which definitely meant that this took a heck of a lot longer, but it was necessary. And when I had finally gotten that done, I made it so that you can click and hold to destroy materials in the world, and so that the correct objects appeared in lists that would handle inventory information. Next, I worked on the inventory page, creating an information panel for each type of item, as well as one for unknown flora, which is for any plants that you aren't yet familiar with the properties of. These you need to research for more information. And I made the background for the page with a set of slots for inventory items. I got the items to appear in the correct slots, assuming that the slot is filled, and created UI to indicate whether clicking on an item has an effect, such as whether you can eat the item, as well as UI to display how many of the item that you have. I added in 3 stats for the player: hunger, health and oxygen, with UI to display how full each of these are. Hunger and oxygen tick down over time unless you're standing next to the oxygen generator in the case of the latter, and if either hit 0 then your health starts to drop. If health hits 0 then you die, for which I needed to make an animation and program it so that the player switches to this as appropriate. I made it so that clicking food items replenishes hunger, and while I was at it I made it so that you can place certain items like seeds. I then powered through and did the art for pretty much every other facility and resource that could appear in the world. For facilities there was the drill, hydroponics bay, analyzer and launch pad, and these will be built by the player. And then I also had to sort out every naturally occurring growing resource for the 4 biomes I had yet to address. Aside from the scrap field that the player starts in and I had already completed, I had to populate the desert, which is full of sandstone and cacti, a sky-themed woodland, which is full of cloud-like trees and bushes, a purple biome full of obsidian and poisonous mushrooms, and finally, a bright red forest filled with fiery trees and flowers. And I'm not going to lie, these last 2 were at least partially inspired by Terraria's Corruption and Crimson. I would have loved to have had time to add more variety to the environmental features of each biomes, more plants, more trees, more types of rock, and I would have loved to add some wacky alien animal species to bring the planet to life. But in a game jam, there just isn't time for that sort of scope, especially with me being on holiday for the final 2 days of the jam, which ate into my time considerably. Not to mention that more variety means more items to add and come up with unique purposes for. As it was, I needed to make items for each of the resources to drop, creating all of the UI to work them into the inventory system I just completed, and I went through and made it so that the resources can be destroyed in the same way as the scrap piles, ferns and trees I'd already added, with the correct items being dropped. The player could also use their collected items to fulfill schematics, and I made a background for the page to display these. These allow you to build facilities that I added a moment ago, as well as to upgrade things like how quickly you can destroy resources or how long your oxygen lasts. Each schematic needed a small icon to represent it, as well as an information panel with a brief description of what the schematic does, what materials it requires, and how much of these materials that you currently have. And those last 2 took a lot of figuring out. I needed to create a set of lists to keep track of which materials respond to which upgrade, and then to check if these materials are in the inventory, and then display the correct value. And I made it so that the schematics actually perform their desired functions, with the facilities, once placed, displaying different costumes depending on whether or not they're actively performing an action, such as generating a resource. I had to sort out some facilities functionality, namely the drill, hydroponics bay and the analyzer, starting with the drill. This will allow you to produce metal, sand or obsidian, although those last 2 would need a schematic upgrade or 2 before becoming unlocked. So for each of these I needed an icon and a description of what clicking the icon does. I got all of this laid out as I wanted it to, and so that it opens when the drill that isn't actively drilling is clicked. And I made it so that clicking the icon set off the drill to produce the appropriate resource. The hydroponics bay was much the same except for the flora instead of the minerals. The biggest deviation was that I had to have separate UI for if the flora hasn't been identified yet, which meant a little bit of extra art and a lot of if-else loops to get working as I needed to, but I eventually got it figured out and working. The analyzer uses some of the same art as the hydroponics bay, so I was able to save some time by reusing a few of the costumes and just adding in a few for saplings and seeds that the hydroponics bay didn't need. I also needed to make UI to display once a new flora has been identified, or identied as I misspelled it, don't worry, I catch that later. And I got all of the flora icons to display if the plant hasn't yet been researched but is in the player's inventory, so I made it so that clicking these items kicks off the research. I then sorted out what happens when the player dies. It displays a message saying what you died of, be it starvation, suffocation or eating poisonous food, and the player loses up to 3 items, with a death screen displaying which these items were. And I added a respawn button. I wanted the player to be able to discover their items, so I made a death box that will contain any items from your most recent death, and made it so that it appears in the right place and returns any items when clicked. I made a title screen, which of course required me to decide on a title. I went with Deep Space Agent 24B, which is tied into the limited story that this game has, with 24B being the player's ID number in the space program Operation Deep Space, and I just thought that it had some nice cadence to it. And for the play button, I made it look like one of the scrap piles in the starting biome to keep everything tied into the visuals of the main game. I then made an opening cutscene to explain exactly how the player wound up on an unfamiliar planet surrounded by a mostly destroyed scientific facility. It starts with a bit of a text dump that appears in line by line, and then changes to a more comic book style delivery with a bit of animation, because the text dump thing would be a boring way of doing the whole thing. The story is continued once the game starts with messages that the player receives through the communications unit. Here the player is able to chat with an operator back on Earth who gives them some survival pointers, meaning that this also acts as a diegetic tutorial. And I got all of the right messages to appear at the right time. There are also some schematics that only unlock once the unit is opened, and a few other occasions that I hadn't yet addressed, so I went through and added all that in. But a story is only as good as its ending, so I sorted that out. I kept it simple. Once you finish building the rocket and click on it, the player hides, the rocket blasts off, and you're taken to a simple game over screen, and this was all fairly simple to implement. I then moved on to sound, adding in little effects when items and buttons are moused over or pressed, and to punctuate the movements of the player, and for when materials and resources are destroyed. Some facilities also had constant ambient sounds like the comms unit, which beeps if you have a pending message, and for these they get louder the closer you are to them, with the sound panning left and right based on the item's position on the screen. When I was working on this project, in the background I just had the Minecraft launcher open, and I realised that the echoey piano music was perfect for my game, so I created a track that was inspired by that, and I added that into my project. I made a thumbnail for the project and filled out the instruction/credit box before releasing the project. I of course also released it on itch.io and submitted it to the jam. And once I got back from that little holiday I mentioned earlier, I played and rated all the other submissions. There were only 6, so this really didn't take too long, and my personal favourite was the game Radiant by Ironic. I came second, again, which I'm not going to complain about. And apart from that, thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed the video. Like and subscribe if you did, it lets me know there's something to see more of. Join the Discord link down below. If you haven't watched the first devlog in this Muu-Off series, then you can click the link on screen to watch that, and I'll see you next week for another video. Bye!